This episode discusses real violence against women, including sexual assault, mutilation, and murder. Listener discretion is advised. America built nearly 50,000 miles of interstate to connect the country. What it also built, whether anybody wanted to admit it or not, was distance, privacy, blind spots. A system wide enough for people to vanish inside. This is Interstate, Highly Deadly. November 3rd, 1998. A man walks into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office in Northern California and says he needs to talk. He is a truck driver. He does not enter wild-eyed or covered in blood. He comes in like a man who has been on the road too long and has finally driven straight into the edge of his own collapse. Then deputies realize he has brought something with him. In his jacket pocket is a woman's severed breast. That man was Wayne Adam Ford. And in that moment, before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the public had any idea what his name was, law enforcement was staring at proof that something far darker had been moving up and down California's roads. Ford would later confess to killing women across the state, and investigators would ultimately tie him to 4 murders committed between 1997 and 1998. It is one of those true crime openings that barely sounds real. But because it is so grotesque, it feels manufactured, like a deleted scene from some grimy late 1990s thriller nobody should have rented twice. But this was not fiction. This was not an urban legend. This was not media hype getting ahead of the facts. This was a sheriff's office, a body part, and the beginning of a case that exposed just how much violence one man had already carried across California. And let's be clear about something right now. This was not a man wandering in because his conscience suddenly woke up and decided to do the right thing. This was not salvation. It was not remorse in any clean or moral sense. It looked more like psychological freefall. By the time Ford walked into that station, women were already dead. Prosecutors later proved 4 counts of first-degree murder. Evidence showed bodies had been dismembered and dumped in waterways. One victim remained unidentified for decades before being named in 2023 as Kerry Ann Cummings. This case stands out, like the others in this series, because it combines mobility, anonymity, and opportunity. Ford was a long-haul trucker, just like the truck stop and happy face serial killers of the same era. A truck gives a predator range. The highway gives him cover. County lines blur. If you have listened to the prior episodes, you know witnesses disappear, jurisdictions disconnect, and all the while, the same road system that keeps America moving can also help a violent man stay one step ahead of consequence. Yes, it's another unsettling and terrifying story about a man, a road, and vulnerable women. With him, though, there is mutilation. Let's face it. It is a shocking idea. A man not only admitting to being a serial killer, but also showing up with a woman's severed breast. It is the realization that for women on the margins, for women alone, for women needing a ride or crossing paths with the wrong man at the wrong time, the danger was not standing still. It was moving and eager to give them a ride. So, before we get into his background, the victims, or the psychology, stay with that first image. A trucker, a sheriff's counter, a jacket pocket. And the instant law enforcement understood they were no longer dealing with a rumor, a disappearance, or a bad feeling. Here before them was yet another truck stop serial killer. So, once Wayne Ford walks into that sheriff's office, the question is not whether something awful happened. That part is settled. The question is how much already happened before he finally stopped. And the answer is plenty. Prosecutors said the victims were dumped across California and some of the bodies had been dismembered. So right away, the case stops being a grotesque, weird-ass moment at the sheriff's office and becomes what it actually is, a mobile murder pattern scattered across a very large state. Keep in mind, California is big enough to hide a lot of failure. One county finds remains. Another county has a missing woman. Somewhere else, a woman vanishes and barely makes the news because she was poor or transient or working the streets or simply living the kind of life this country treats as disposable, right up until a body turns up. Ford's case moved through those gaps. He was able to kill like this because the system leaves openings everywhere. Ford's own defense later tried to frame his surrender as the act of a man with a conscience, a man who finally did the right thing after doing many wrong ones. But by the time he showed up, bodies had already been cut apart and families were already living inside unanswered loss. Whatever was breaking down inside him came after the violence, not before it. Ford did not need intelligence, charm, or some Hannibal Lecter nonsense to keep killing. He needed access, movement, and a country built around the idea that if something bad happens 50 miles away, it is apparently someone else's problem. He had all three. The remains were found roughly 600 miles apart in a straight line and about 700 plus miles apart by road. That spread is part of what made the case harder to grasp in one clean frame. It is harder to see a pattern when the pieces are scattered, and men like Ford benefit from that scatter. Kerry Ann Cummings, one of his victims whom they could not identify until 2023, was born in 1972. Her last confirmed contact with family was in 1997. At that point, according to her sister and Humboldt County investigators, she was experiencing untreated mental illness and told family she was couch surfing in the Eugene, Oregon area. Despite repeated offers from family, she refused to come home. Her sister, Kathy Cummings, described Kerry as beautiful, funny, smart, and an artist who was great at making the family laugh. Kathy also said Kerry's decline happened fast, calling it devastating what mental illness could do in only 2 short years. After Ford turned himself in, a dismembered female torso was found in Ryan Slough near Eureka in October 1997, and additional remains were recovered on Clam Beach in January 1998. That was Kerry, but she remained a Jane Doe for decades, sadly. I've been to Eureka and Clam Beach. It's Northern California, not far from the redwoods and scenic little beach towns. The homeless situation around Eureka is very clear today, though, and although I am sure it's worse these days than it was back in the late 1990s, I can still see how a young, unhoused female could easily disappear from this area. Kerry's family did try to find her. According to the sheriff's office, her parents attempted to report her missing in Arizona and Oregon, and even hired a private investigator. But because of how missing adult cases were handled at the time, no formal missing person report was taken. As a result, Kerry was never entered into national missing person databases, which likely made identification much harder. Cases involving women on the margins routinely get less urgency, less media heat, and less coordinated follow-through. That is not cynicism. That is the track record. Ford was moving through exactly that kind of indifference. Being a trucker did not create sadism. What it did was remove friction. It widened Ford's hunting ground and lowered the odds that one jurisdiction would immediately connect what another one was finding. This is the underlying reality in cases of this nature. The open road gets sold to Americans as freedom, escape, reinvention, the horizon, all that Bruce Springsteen adjacent mythology. Hell, I love road trips. Come on, that's a huge American thing. We are raised to look at the highways and under those big blue skies and dream of adventure. But for the wrong man, the same system becomes privacy, disposal, and time. Time to leave, time to cross a county line, time for evidence to drift, time for a woman's name to fall out of the headlines before anyone has even figured out where she went. And once you understand that, Ford's surrender starts to look less like a dramatic ending and more like the first time his momentum failed him, because eventually even a moving crime scene runs out of road. Before Ford became the guy who walked into a sheriff's office carrying evidence of his own depravity, he was doing a solid impression of one of those guys everyone thought would amount to nothing and didn't want to invite to the party because he was weird as hell. A grade A pervert, and an all-around dick. But at the end of the day, he was just another man with a job, a history, and enough unresolved damage to fill a storage unit. The defense would later lean hard on that damage, especially a serious head injury Ford said he suffered years earlier in a highway crash. In a 1999 jail interview, he claimed the injury changed him and argued that what followed should have been treated medically. So let's get into that, because admittedly, when getting into the research, it is clear things go to hell after the head injury. He was born in Petaluma, California in 1961. His parents divorced when he was young, and he spent time going back and forth between the two homes. By the time he was 12 years old, he started just staying with friends rather than living with either parent who he didn't feel he was close to. At 15, he moved in with his uncle, and by 17, he had joined the Marines. It was 1979. Then he was stationed at the Marine base in El Toro, California, where he met a young woman named Kelly Dick and married her in Vegas. He was 19 years old when they married. Not long after the marriage, he was on the side of the freeway trying to help a crash victim when a drunk driver hit him, knocking him down an embankment and causing a traumatic brain injury. It is important to say that after this time, his personality changed. His life takes a noticeable turn here. His wife became pregnant, and he reportedly forced her to have an abortion. Not long after forcing his wife to abort their child, he was accused of raping a 15-year-old girl, and he left town but was caught and arrested for the crime. His wife asked for a divorce, certainly understandable. By age 22, he was admitted into the Naval Hospital's psychiatric ward for homicidal ideations. That's huge because he was clearly thinking about killing people, admitted it, and was committed. You do not usually see this in a killer's history, occasionally, of course, but most killers never make it to the mental hospital. And that is where these stories always try to get slippery, because once the words brain injury enters the room, people start reaching for a tidy explanation, like human violence is a toaster you can diagnose by unplugging it and tapping the side. But even Ford's own claim, taken at face value, does not do the work people want it to do. It may help explain deterioration. It does not explain the choice, and it definitely does not explain mutilation. You do not accidentally drift from troubled into carrying body parts around like the world's worst lunchbox. What the record does show is a man unraveling long before the confession. By the penalty phase of his trial, his defense team was trying to present him as psychologically damaged, remorseful, and impaired, and his past pointed to that. He was discharged from the Marines after 6 years. He had risen to sergeant and was later demoted to corporal before discharge, and after the alleged rape and hospitalization. His discharge read, "Convenience of the government, character and behavior disorders." Again, very telling, considering what he eventually ends up doing. His psychiatrist diagnosed Wayne with adjustment reaction with mixed features and a personality disorder with explosive and immature features. Depending on what sources you read for the research on him, some sources reflect more than one mental hospital stint before being discharged from the Marines. After he was discharged, things only got stranger. He took a job driving delivery trucks for Sears and Ward's and another job repairing boats, though he soon quit and moved to Southern California because the work was beneath him. This is also around the time that he began to go by his middle name, which is Adam. From 24 to 26, he continued to jump from job to job. He never had one for very long. He also had several short-term relationships. He was arrested for animal cruelty, for shooting a dog, He also started sneaking around and watching people through their windows. By 31, he was essentially a deadbeat, floating around doing a whole lot of nothing, and the rest of the time causing harm to women and animals. I have to say it, this guy had become a total piece of shit. Still, he managed to get married again for some god-awful reason to a woman named Elizabeth. He had a son with her. He was an on-again, off-again trucker at this time. The marriage did not last. Can't say I'm surprised by that. It is during this time that the first Jane Doe is found by a duck hunter. She was labeled the torso girl because she was dismembered. He did go to a mental health clinic again, but he did not follow through on any treatment. He also got really drunk and rambled to others that he hated women, wanted to cut them up and hide their parts. That's terribly specific, isn't it? By the next year, when his divorce from his second wife was finally finalized, another body was found. She was floating in an aqueduct near Buttonwillow, California. He would later admit that he picked her up and raped her. She was Tina Gibbs. Within months, he does it again and again. One of the women was Lanett White, whose body was found nude and on the side of I-5 near Lodi, California. It is said she was walking on the side of the road and going to the grocery store when he abducted her. He would later report that he started praying and listening to Bible cassettes because of the fear that he had no conscience. His brother, Calvin Rodney Ford, testified that when Wayne called him in 1998, he said he had hurt some people. Rodney drove hours to meet him, not yet knowing the full truth, and later accompanied him to the Humboldt County Sheriff's Station, where Wayne nearly lost his nerve and considered walking back out. Even at the edge, even with the thing already collapsing, he was still hesitating, still calculating, still close to choosing himself over the women he had already erased. The confession was wobbling, partial, unstable. Less, my conscience made me do the right thing. More, the machine is finally breaking down, and I don't know what to do with what I've become. And honestly, that fits the broader pattern better than any neat redemption story. Ford was not operating from some elegant, dark philosophy. He had become a deeply violent man whose damage, rage, and compulsions were no longer staying inside the lines of whatever life he had managed to fake for himself. He not only gave investigators the cut-off breast of Anne, but also showed them where he had buried the legs of Torso Girl. He did not remember her name, which is why she stayed a Jane Doe for so long. So when people ask who Wayne Adam Ford was before the headlines, the answer, he was a man falling apart. It is believed that he actually killed 6 women, but he was convicted of only 4 victims, and those are also the only 4 he would admit to. He tried to say that he doesn't remember killing them, which is not believable, but they were all strangled. He admitted to liking to cause pain during sex prior to his murders and during, but the mutilations were done after he had strangled his victims. He was also a necrophiliac, which means he had sex with women after their death. Prosecutors said Ford targeted women desperate enough to get into his truck for sex money, and during the trial, they argued that he counted on the fact that some of them might not be missed. That is not poetic license. That was the prosecution's point. The 4 women tied to his murder convictions were Lanett White, 25, of Fontana, Tina Gibbs, 26, of Las Vegas, Patricia Tamez, 29, of Hesperia, and the woman long known only as Humboldt County Jane Doe, whose remains were found in 1997 and who was finally identified as Kerry Cummings. That lineup tells you a lot before you even get into the details. Different cities, different circumstances, same basic exposure. Also, I need to say, I looked into all of these women to try to get more information. There was only a little information on Kerry, the torso girl Jane Doe. The others, there is pretty much no information on them. Only their names, locations, and ages. That says so much about our society without saying anything at all. We know more about their killer than we will ever know about them. Ford was not hunting in some dramatic, cinematic way, like a villain in a leather jacket with a murder playlist. He was working with a simpler formula, women with fewer buffers between themselves and danger, women who needed something, women who were alone, women the larger system had already abandoned before he ever showed up. It worked, and we need to ask, if he had not called his brother and gone to the cops, would we ever have known he killed these women? Probably not. There are so many dead women found off highways during this time frame whose killers remain unknown, so we should give him that. He did more than other killers like him. He turned himself in, at least. And this is where true crime gets ridiculous if you let it. It starts talking about prey and monsters and other canned language from the cable TV landfill, when the reality is more stripped down and more insulting. Ford did not need supernatural evil. There was also a surviving woman identified in court as Sonoma County Jane Doe, who testified that Ford picked her because she was small and easier to control. She said he bound, raped, strangled, revived, and dumped her alive by the roadside. That testimony mattered because it showed a method, not chaos, not one bad night, method, selection, control, repetition. He was not stumbling through these encounters like some confused caveman with a trucking schedule. He knew exactly what kind of woman he wanted and why. He liked small, petite, attractive women. His MO was to proposition them for sex or offer a ride, rape them, or start the sexual transaction but become violent. When the women protested, he would then strangle them. But as sick as this is, it is worse. He would revive them, strangle them again, and so on until they finally died. Absolutely sadistic. And once you see that seam, the next question is unavoidable. How exactly did he approach them, control them, and keep repeating this pattern without getting stopped sooner? Ford did not operate like some cinematic super predator. He was not dazzling women. He was not hypnotizing anybody with charisma and cheekbones. He was using access, physical force, and the brutal math of vulnerability. Prosecutors said 3 of the women he killed were sex workers and 1 was a hitchhiker. In court, they argued that Ford selected women he believed were less likely to trigger immediate alarm if they vanished. Ford's truck helped with that. A semi is a workplace, a private enclosure, and a moving barrier between a victim and everybody else. It is basically the worst possible Uber. The woman who testified described being bound, raped, and strangled, then left by the roadside after he believed she was dead. That testimony did 2 things at once. It showed selection and it showed sequence. He was not snapping. He was working through a process. And that process matters more than lurid detail ever will, because once you see a sequence, you see intention. Approach, isolate, overpower, assault, strangle, dispose, repeat. That is not confusion. That is not a tragic little blackout fairy tale. His defense really tried to sell jurors on mental impairment and blackouts, but prosecutors pushed back with evidence of repeated conduct, body disposal, and mutilation. The jury convicted him of 4 counts of first-degree murder in June 2006 and later returned a death verdict. There is also something important here that gets lost when people obsess over the gore. Control was the point, not just sex, not just violence, control. Picking a smaller woman because she is easier to dominate tells you exactly what kind of man you are dealing with, not so much an overwhelmed soul in the throes of mysterious darkness, just a predator making practical decisions in service of his own cruelty, grimly efficient, spiritually bankrupt. Basically, a man who turned misogyny into a workflow. Once you grasp that, the confession appears differently. He did not walk into that station because the killings were incomprehensible even to him. He knew what he had done. He knew how he had done it. He knew enough to hesitate before fully confessing and enough to need his brother pushing him forward when he started to stall. So the next question is not whether he had a pattern. He did. The next question is what finally made that pattern break? So what stopped Ford was not a traffic stop, not a brilliant multi-county task force, and not some heroic last-minute intervention from a system firing on all cylinders for once. What stopped him was collapse. Personal, messy, unstable collapse. According to reporting, Ford spent the night drinking heavily in a cheap Eureka motel room with his brother Rodney before the two men went to the sheriff's office early on November 3rd, 1998. He brought a Bible. He brought a plastic bag containing Patricia Tamez's severed left breast. That matters because people love a redemption narrative. They want the confession to mean something clean. They want a switch flipped. Conscience arrived. Evil surrendered. Roll credits. But that is not what this looks like. This looks like a man who had reached the point where he could no longer carry the weight of what he had done without cracking open in full public view. Then Wayne sat down and gave a recorded confession describing the killings. In that account, he admitted dismembering at least one victim and told detectives he had tried to make her small. That is the kind of sentence that strips all the romance out of criminal psychology in one shot. No mystery. If Ford had truly wanted to stop the pattern earlier, there were many exits available before body parts in a plastic bag. He could have stopped after the first assault. He could have stopped after the first killing. The machinery inside him stopped functioning. That is not noble. It is just late. Very, very late. Now the story shifts to something colder. What he said about the killings, what the evidence showed, and where his excuses started falling apart. Ford tried to frame the killings as accidental or partly outside his control. At trial, prosecutors explicitly warned jurors not to be swayed by the confession itself, arguing that the issue was not whether he admitted involvement, but whether the killings were deliberate, because the physical record in this case was grimly practical. According to reporting on the verdict, Ford admitted that the unidentified hitchhiker whose torso had been found, he dismembered her body with a hunting knife, stored some body parts in his freezer, buried some remains, and dropped others into the Mad River. That is not chaos. That is labor. Disturbing, intentional, hands-on labor. Nobody sleepwalks through that much cleanup. That is the part that tends to blow up the softer defense language. Once somebody starts using words like blackout, impairment, or broken conscience, there is a temptation to imagine one explosive moment followed by confusion. But this case did not present like one catastrophic burst. A fog rolled in. Something took over. He was battling demons. Fine. Cute. Meanwhile, in the real world, women were being strangled, cut apart, and discarded in waterways while he kept moving. Because evidence has a way of stripping a man down to his choices. And in this case, his choices were all over California. That verdict did not restore the women. It did not erase what happened in those truck cabs, along those roads, or in those waterways. It just marked the point where the state finally caught up to a man who had been using distance and vulnerability like tools. So, if you want the final truth about Wayne Adam Ford, it is not that he was some spooky monster roaming the highways with supernatural cunning. He was a sadistic man with access, opportunity, and victims the broader world did not value enough, soon enough. The road helped him. Indifference helped him. Delay helped him, and when he finally broke, he did not stop because the system outsmarted him. He stopped because he could no longer contain what he had done. By then, 4 women were dead, 1 had gone unnamed for 25 years, and the bill for all of it had already come due. Lanett White, Tina Renee Gibbs, Patricia Tamez, Kerry Ann Cummings. They were here. They mattered. And they deserved to be protected long before they were identified, counted, or folded into a courtroom narrative. Wayne Adam Ford remains a condemned California inmate today, meaning he is still under a death sentence. However, he will likely die in prison of natural causes rather than be executed because California has had no execution since 2006, and Governor Gavin Newsom's 2019 moratorium is still in effect. while the state has also dismantled the old death row system and moved away from maintaining the machinery of execution. Thank you for listening. I'm Becca. If this episode meant something to you, follow the show, leave a rating, and share it. That helps more people find the stories that were buried, the victims who were minimized, and the truth that never stayed where people tried to dump it. Because the past is not dead, it's just walking the shoulder at night.